Have you ever been watching a show and just thought, man, a cell phone would really fix this situation? Man, McDonald's would really fix this situation. Man, a gun would really fix this situation. Man, OnlyFans would I'm gonna get in trouble. Of all the genres that exist of storytelling, none match the potential of fantasy. When written well, wide, unfamiliar worlds and weathers, fascinating peoples and cultures, mystifying magics and mythical creatures all come together for what I've found the most captivating experience since slavery. A world truly well built and thought out has the wondrous power to draw people in, touch them, and change them forever like Epstein's Island. But in enjoying these marvelous misadventures, I've realized they aren't all equally well thought out. With no explanation, there's one thing that's glaringly absent from most fantasy worlds. I'm sorry, I have no idea how I was the fastest sperm. Science. The great missing piece of all the great fantasies is science. Healing magic doesn't cure diseases, carrier pigeons can't coordinate armies or respond to invasions, bicycles don't cost as much to feed as horses, and cars are faster than either of those. Even in fantasy worlds sprawling with the unimaginable, the mundane commodities we've come to take for granted would be invaluable. So why don't fantasy worlds have any technology? The video poll said you want to know, so I have to talk about it, and if I want to convincingly answer that question, we need to understand why science is necessary at all. Just to be clear, I'm not talking about stories which just so happen to be set at a point in time before technology is allowed to develop, so much as worlds where, like my romantic history, science completely stalls and fails to progress over the course of centuries, millennia, eons. The typical swords and sorcery setting is about as advanced as Western Europe in the High Middle Ages. We have our kingdoms and aristocrats, guilds, and artisans. Literacy rates are questionable, and the church holds as much influence as royalty. Obviously, unlike our own medieval era, these worlds enjoy the blessing of magic, a natural phenomenon that can be wielded to completely violate the laws of physics science is so proud of. With the very power of miracles in hand, what significance could any of our petty trinkets possibly hold? Honestly, if every person could use magic, probably none. The flaw of the typical magical society, however, is that only a very select few can use magic, either at all or with any reasonable proficiency. This is where science comes in. Even if mages have the ability to fly, accelerate the growth of plants, preserve food, warm their homes, and communicate via seeing crystal, the mortal man is only about as capable as an arts major. Not very. He still needs to drive his wagon through the dark forest of vicious beasts and rely on the cycle of seasons and fertility of soil to eat. He still fears freezing in the winter when firewood isn't plenty enough for the town, and must struggle to keep his food, if he managed to harvest any, in edible condition that he may not starve before the next harvest. If attacked by bandits or beasts, or if he witnesses an invasion, his only means to tell the city guard would be by word of mouth, which he'd unlikely live long enough to manage. If a harvest was plenty, all the townsfolk would have more than they could eat, but with no technology as advanced as canning to preserve the food for years to come, and no locomotives either to allow you to carry your produce to other settlements for trade, the food would go to waste. While speaking of trade, if your settlement were small or remote enough due to the dangers merchants would face on a journey to your domain, they might choose altogether not to visit, leaving you without resources such as metals, leathers, or sugar. And don't get me started on mortality rates in an era with no vaccines, antibiotics, or any other modern medicine. These are problems our own world had to deal with fewer than 1,000 years ago. Albeit there was never a risk chicken could have you for dinner. But this is where technological innovation gave us rail cars, planes, automobiles, farming implements, theories and fertilizers, the radio and telegraph, and penicillin, and so much more. Fantasy worlds slap band-aids on their problems, hiring adventurers to defend caravans from monsters instead of inventing permanent solutions that could evade them entirely. And that's what so many people rightfully don't understand. Why is there no science in fantasy worlds? Answer number 1. Occam's razor, a principle attributed to a man from the very medieval era we're discussing, suggests that when we have multiple different ideas competing to explain a single phenomenon, we should prefer the most simple explanation. In this case, that would be because the writers want it that way. If an author wishes for their Middle Ages to be the only ages, even if those times persist for thousands of years, as in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, no one can really say anything about it. Tolkien hated industrialization as he believed it to be the cause of the ever-intensifying wars the world experienced during his time. Publishing The Hobbit after having lived through the Great War at a time when Nazi Germany was rallying its people behind the Volkswagen, and publishing the Lord of the Rings trilogy after further having lived to witness the atomic death of World War II, he could never allow his precious Middle-earth to follow Europe's same dark path, and writers with similarly nostalgic outlooks on the past or plain disdain for the present might never wish for their worlds to appear any different from how they were first created. If we are to go with the next simplest explanation, that would have to be that writers were just bad at their jobs and failed to take into account in their writing just how recent the Middle Ages were. Through the 11th to 15th centuries, ancient China saw the invention and development of the movable type, the earliest solution to the large-scale transcription of text. Before Bi Sheng's invention of the earliest versions of the device around 1040 AD, copies of books and scrolls would each require months of a scribe's dedicated efforts to reproduce, but with the movable type, a single man could make hundreds of copies of one document. The technology improved over the course of the next few hundred years, but in the name of Confucianism, it was forbidden to commercialize printing technology, and the power remained in the hands of the Chinese government. Now, for anyone new here, I'm sorry this had to get so educational. I promise if you go watch some of my recent, probably more successful videos, I'm usually more entertaining, but for the sake of doing this topic justice, yes, I'm still talking about fantasy worlds, I need to paint a picture of how humanity got to where it is now. If you're a sicko like me who likes this stuff, subscribe so I know to make more videos like this every now and then. Getting back to what I was saying before, because China obsessed over controlling this technology, its development was ultimately slowed. That is, until word of its existence traveled west. When it came to be known in Europe in the 1400s that China was bedeviled over the advancement of this technology, they began their own efforts to reproduce it, and within just decades were successful and had exceeded what they sought to steal. At this point in time, Europe had suffered the effects of the Black Death and the 100-Year War, so they had actually been in a state of decline. But after the single introduction of the movable type by craftsman Johannes Gutenberg, then by his development of technology into the printing press, Europe was able to leap immediately from a great decline to the glorious Renaissance that saw such development of art and culture and rise in literacy that human development exploded. Within fewer than 200 years after the printing press, we had steam engines, and within a lifetime from that, the Age of Reason historians would go so far as to call the Enlightenment had begun. The point of all this is to say fantasy worlds all exist at a point in time where the simple introduction of a single device, the printing press, would be enough to spark an industrial revolution within the lifespan of a dwarf, and allow fantasy civilization to altogether surpass modern humanity in the time between an elf's 2 visits to a human city. With this being said, it isn't at all far-fetched to suggest that some lesser writers might just not understand history well enough to have developed their worlds accordingly. Those answers are both boring, though, and aren't what anyone wants to hear. That brings us to the complicated answer number 3. If we forget for a moment that these worlds are all just the imaginings of wordsmiths and allow ourselves to believe their developments were completely natural within the flow of their histories, if we pretend that Frieren and company are all real people living in a parallel dimension, if we accept that there's an alternate reality where the Zhao family and Soaring Six Sapphire sect really exist, and cultivators can live hundreds of thousands of years, then again I ask for the who knows how manyth time, why don't fantasy worlds have science? First, because pursuing science is like pursuing an arts degree. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, and conversely, any sufficiently understood magic is indistinguishable from science. The modern literary take on magic presents it as a system, controlled through incantations and circles, amplified by reagents, and only successful in the hands of a suitably trained and skillful practitioner. That is what magic is. A science that exploits the natural laws of the fantasy world. While I have explained at great length, I'm sorry, how realistic scientific advancement would benefit these worlds, the inhabitants are too blind to see it. Why on God's green insert world name here would any reasonable people dedicate their lives to the founding of geology if a mage could be hired to find mineral deposits? Why would iron and fuels be wasted experimenting over centuries to develop meaningful steam engines to pump water out of mines if magic was capable of doing the job without lifetimes of buildup? In our world, the pursuit of science was noble because every advancement would permanently push humanity as a collective forward, and that progress would never be lost. The steam engines for water pumping were eventually able to give us cars and railways, jets and spacecraft, and the combustion engine in general. The worthless piles of metal with a 0.5% energy conversion efficiency all those years ago is the reason we have F1 cars with 50% efficient engines today, a literal 100-fold improvement. The furthering of science works because technology is bad, then people try to make it better. But in a magical society, individuals who would have to be brilliant enough for successful careers in magic would have to completely disregard personal prosperity for the vague notion that countless years after they were gone, their animal-drawn tractors would become, when combined with the discoveries of countless other fools, machines capable of doing the farming of hundreds of men. I didn't bring up the arts to insult any respected professions, but to recognize that as much as political science, sociology, psychology, and criminology benefit humanity today, trying to work towards developing those fields in the days everyone had to be a farmer or soldier to live would have seemed like a gross misappropriation of a talented man's mental faculties. That's not the full extent of the problem when exploring answer number 3, though. This assumes a willingness of the people to develop technology and that no opposition exists, but there's no way that would be the case. First, although One Piece does indeed develop technology in some unusual fashion, I'll excuse similar worlds where the geography prevents cultural cross-pollination and individual societies are forcefully isolated. I'll also count out any worlds under strict supervision by an almighty entity that would never allow for technology. If a dragon or god says no, it only makes sense to listen. For the oppressive enemy I wish now to discuss, we'll have to take a look at the French Revolution of 1789 and the greater collapse of the aristocracy. Imagine this: you are a count. By virtue of being the child of the previous lord of your county, you benefit from the heavy taxes of everyone who wasn't born as your father's son. When you retire or die, your child will take over after you, and for as long as you live, you will never want for anything. The only duty you have is to govern the land, keeping it safe from invasion and economically prosperous, but that's something you could honestly hire someone else to do so you could focus on fine dining and extending your lineage. As a human being, there's got to be a part of you that thinks, if I was the one in that position, it'd actually be pretty sweet. And obviously, nobility knew they had it infinitely better than the peasants, so if there was anything they cared about, it was making sure nothing could endanger their peerage or position. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords amassed powerful cavalries to this end. Naturally, military forces could defend territories against enemies without, but they were just as effective against the enemies within. The knights would be granted their own properties in exchange for their loyalty and servitude, and they squashed rebellions in exchange. That brings us to the French Revolution. 1787 was long after the Middle Ages. This was the early industrial era when the commoners had been educated and realized, hold on, why did they get to be born with everything and control everyone, while we can't even own the lands we spend our lives slaving away on? As economic crisis and the Little Ice Age quickly ruined the common man, the peasantry reached a breaking point beyond which they could no longer tolerate tyranny. At this point in time, French King Louis XVI could not possibly hold off his population of 26 million, the largest in Europe, with mere cavalry. Knights had long since become worthless, and riflemen, even if skillful, could not defeat armies that outnumbered them 10 times over with firearms of their own. Further, even if they miraculously did, there would be no citizenry left to actually carry out the kingdom's labors. What I hope you take away from this story is another reason scientific advancement might be hampered in fantasy lands. Nobility could enjoy essentially futuristic lives through the employ of wizards and would stop anything with the potential to ruin that. Unlike Earth, where kings would want the development of guns to advance to lay waste to their enemies despite the risks of said weapons being turned against themselves, there's no need for a fantastical aristocracy that has control over breathing tanks to want such dangerous tools to exist, especially considering I don't think the magic towers have deduced how to cast Kevlar. Every advancement in science would weaken their hold over the peasants and eventually lead them to believe they could govern themselves, as came to be the case in actual human history. I could give more details exploring the political prohibitions on science, but I think all 13 of you ultra-loyal viewers still sitting through this history class would rather I wrap it up, so it's time for my favorite part of Answer 3. Let's take a look at the fantasy-scapes of a cultivation world. If not for oppression or a reliance on mages, why in the world would science not develop at all through the hundreds of thousands of years the immortals live? Honestly speaking, as important as Pursuit of the Tao may be, a 1000-year side quest by just a small group of bored venerables would be enough to make smartphones if you consider their vast powers. So why don't they have science either? Well, they honestly have the least need out of anyone if cultivation is a legitimate path to immortality, but if we're going along with the benefits to regular people like before, the problem in worlds like this would be the common mindset. If Isaac Newton was a cultivator, best believe his laws of gravity and motion would be the core heritage of his sect that only select elders and successive patriarchs would be allowed to learn. Anyone who attained profound insights into natural laws would gain an enlightenment into the Tao of the principle in question, and see their strength increase. So instead of strengthening one's enemies for the sake of some common people, any valuable knowledge would be hidden away. And if we learned anything from the last video, if a mortal with good intentions happened to make this discovery and hoped to publicize it for the good of man, a demonic path cultivator would likely kill him and steal his notes before he'd ever have the chance to waste something so heaven-defying. If we're really being honest here, even if science did develop, it would surely lead to extinction. God forbid the Tao of nuclear physics falls into the wrong hands. I'm trying to make this video in about 20% of the time it took to make the cultivation video, which is honestly the best video I've ever made, no idea how I'll top that, so you could probably tell this was pretty rough around the edges. Nevertheless, I hope this gave you something to think about while you wait for the video on Murim Manhwa. That's up next and is under production as you're watching this. If this is your first video here, look around a bit more and consider subscribing before you leave. And if there's something wrong with you and you'd like more educational videos in the future, let me know in the comments so I can incorporate more facts into my scripts from now on. Like the video if you liked the video. This has been Kenchan giving a TED Talk.